sentences that tend to circle through the mind of almost every parent living through distance from their child, usually on repeat, usually late at night. The first one is, "It's all my fault." The second one is, "No, actually, it's their fault after everything I gave them." What's strange, if you actually watch yourself do this, is how fast you can flip between the two. Sometimes in the same hour, sometimes in the same conversation with yourself. Total self-blame, then total blame of your child, back and forth, like a pendulum that never quite settles anywhere that actually feels true. A psychiatrist who spent his entire career studying exactly this kind of internal split has a name for what's actually happening underneath that pendulum swing, and understanding it is going to do something I don't think either extreme, all my fault or all their fault, has ever actually done for you. It's going to let both of those thoughts stop running the show. Stay with me, because this gets into some of the deepest psychological territory we've covered on this channel, and I think it's going to explain a pattern you've probably been stuck inside for longer than you realized. The thinker at the center of today's episode is Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who, alongside Freud, helped found modern depth psychology, though he eventually broke from Freud and built his own, distinct framework for understanding the mind. Jung's work covers an enormous amount of territory, but the concept I want to spend most of this episode on is one of his most famous, and I think one of the most quietly useful ideas in all of psychology for exactly the situation we're discussing today. What Jung called the shadow. Jung's shadow isn't a metaphor for evil, even though it sometimes gets flattened into that in pop psychology. The shadow, in Jung's actual writing, refers to the parts of ourselves we've pushed out of our conscious self-image. Not necessarily bad parts, just parts that don't fit the story we've built about who we are. Jung believed every person constructs a version of themselves they can live with, a self-image, and that anything incompatible with that self-image doesn't disappear. It gets pushed into an unconscious holding pattern Jung called the shadow, where it keeps operating, keeps influencing us, just without our direct awareness that it's doing so. Here's the mechanism that I think matters most for this episode, and it's one of Jung's central claims. The shadow doesn't stay quietly hidden. It leaks out, and one of its most common leaking points is projection, attributing the disowned part of ourselves onto someone else, usually someone close enough that the projection has somewhere to land. Jung wrote that everything which is unconscious in ourselves we tend to discover in our neighbor, and that we treat that discovery accordingly, meaning we often react most intensely, most emotionally, to the exact qualities in other people that we haven't fully faced in ourselves. I want to slow down here, because I think this is where the pendulum we opened with actually starts to make sense. If you're a parent living through distance from your child, and your mind keeps swinging between "it's entirely my fault" and "it's entirely their fault," Jung's framework suggests something worth sitting with. Both of those positions might be doing the same underlying job, protecting you from a more complicated, less resolvable truth, which is that responsibility here probably isn't fully on either side, and that ambiguity is much harder to tolerate than a clean verdict, even a self-condemning one. Total self-blame can feel unbearable, but it has a strange kind of psychological comfort hidden inside it. It gives you control. If it's entirely your fault, that means it was entirely within your power to prevent, and by extension, within your power to fix, if only you find the right apology, the right insight, the right corrected behavior. Total blame of your child offers a different but related comfort. It protects your self-image, keeps the version of yourself you can live with fully intact, and locates the entire problem safely outside of you, where it doesn't require you to look at anything uncomfortable in your own shadow. Jung would say neither of these positions is really about accuracy. They're about which discomfort you find more tolerable to sit inside. The discomfort of total responsibility, or the discomfort of total innocence purchased at your child's expense. I want to bring in a second voice here, because I think she gives us language Jung didn't quite have, even though her work sits directly on top of his foundation. Brené Brown, a researcher who spent decades studying shame and vulnerability, makes a distinction that I think is one of the most clarifying ideas available for exactly this situation: the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt, in Brown's research, sounds like, I did something bad. Shame sounds like, I am something bad. Guilt focuses on behavior, a specific, nameable action that can be examined, understood, and in many cases, repaired. Shame focuses on identity, a global verdict about your entire worth as a person, which by its nature can't actually be repaired because it was never about a specific, correctable action in the first place. Brown's research found something I think directly explains why the self-blame pendulum swing feels so exhausting and so unproductive. Guilt, when it stays guilt, tends to motivate genuine repair. You did something specific. You can address that specific thing. But guilt very often doesn't stay guilt. It slides into shame, especially under enough internal pressure. And once it becomes shame, once I made mistakes as a parent becomes I am a bad parent, full stop, as a total identity. Brown's research shows something almost counterintuitive happens. Shame actually makes people less capable of accountability, not more, because shame is so painful that the mind's most common response to it isn't growth, it's defense, which is exactly why the pendulum swings so hard toward blaming the child instead. Not because the guilt disappeared, but because it became shame, and shame became unbearable, and blame became the fastest available exit from that particular unbearable feeling. I think this is genuinely one of the most useful diagnostic tools this channel has offered, because it gives you a specific question to ask yourself the next time you catch that pendulum swinging. When I think about my role in this distance, am I thinking in terms of guilt, specific, nameable things I did or didn't do, or am I thinking in terms of shame, a global verdict about my worth as a parent or a person? Because those two require completely different responses. Guilt can actually be worked with. It can inform an amends letter, a changed behavior, a genuine repair attempt, the kind we discussed in our episode on estrangement statistics. Shame, left unexamined, mostly just needs somewhere to go, and blaming your child is one of the most common places it ends up landing. I want to bring in one more voice, because I think he offers the piece that ties Jung and Brown together into something you can actually use going forward. James Hollis, a contemporary Jungian analyst who has written extensively about guilt, projection, and what he calls the second half of life. The period when people are often forced to reckon honestly with choices made decades earlier, including as parents, makes an argument that I think lands directly on this episode's core question. Hollis suggests that healthy guilt requires what he calls owning your own material, acknowledging your actual, specific contribution to a painful situation without either inflating it into total responsibility or deflating it into total innocence. He describes this as one of the genuinely hardest psychological tasks a person can undertake, precisely because both inflation and deflation are so much more emotionally comfortable than accuracy. Hollis's clinical work suggests a specific practice for doing this, and I think it's worth walking through directly, because it turns Jung's fairly abstract shadow concept into something concrete you can actually sit down and do. The practice starts with separating the situation into distinct, specific claims, rather than one giant, undifferentiated verdict. Instead of "I ruined my child's life," or "my child is ungrateful after everything I did," you write down, as specifically as you can, the actual events. What happened, when, what you said, what you didn't say, what you now understand differently than you did at the time. Hollis's point is that shame thrives on vagueness, on totalizing language, on always and never and everything. Guilt, the workable kind, requires specificity, because specificity is what makes something correctable rather than just something to be endlessly felt. Once you have that more specific accounting, Hollis suggests a second step that I think connects directly back to Jung's shadow concept. Asking honestly which parts of your reaction to your child's distance might be less about them specifically and more about something in your own history being triggered. A shadow, in Jung's language, that your child's distance happens to be illuminating, whether or not they intended to. This isn't about letting your child off the hook for anything real they may have said or done. It's about noticing when your reaction seems disproportionate to the actual event in front of you, because disproportionate reactions are often, in Jung's framework, a signal that shadow material has been activated. Some older wound, some earlier rejection, some long-buried belief about your own worth, using this current situation as an opportunity to finally get your attention. I think this is where Jung's work becomes genuinely healing rather than just theoretically interesting, because it offers a way out of the blame pendulum that doesn't require pretending the situation is simple. You don't have to choose between entirely my fault and entirely their fault. Jung would say the actual work is looking directly at both. Your specific, real, ownable contribution, examined honestly and without shame's distorting inflation, and your child's specific, real, separate agency and choices, which are genuinely theirs and not fully within your control or your responsibility to carry. Both of those can be true, held side by side, without either one canceling the other out. I want to say something about what this looks like practically, because I don't want this to stay abstract. If you notice yourself spiraling into, "it's all my fault," Hollis and Brown's combined framework suggests asking, is this guilt about something specific I can actually name and potentially repair? Or has it slid into shame, a totalizing verdict about my entire worth? If it's shame, the useful move isn't more self-examination in that moment. Shame doesn't respond well to more scrutiny, it just deepens. The useful move is closer to what Brown's research recommends. Naming the shame out loud, to a trusted person or even to yourself, specifically as shame rather than as truth, because shame loses a significant amount of its power the moment it's spoken rather than just endured silently. If you notice yourself spiraling into blaming your child entirely, Jung's shadow concept suggests a different, quieter question. What about this situation feels unbearable enough that blame is the fastest way out of it? Not to excuse anything your child may have genuinely done that caused real pain, but to notice whether the intensity of your reaction matches the actual event or whether something older is riding along with it, using this moment as a stage. I think what Jung ultimately offers here, more than any specific technique, is a different relationship to guilt itself. He wasn't interested in eliminating guilt, and I don't think this channel should be either. Appropriate guilt, the specific, ownable kind, is actually part of how genuine repair becomes possible, the kind of repair we discussed when we talked about effective amends letters. What Jung was interested in was helping people stop being unconsciously run by guilt and blame they never examined directly. Stop letting the shadow drive the car while you sit in the passenger seat, convinced you're the one steering. Healing here, in Jung's sense, doesn't mean arriving at a verdict, either self-condemning or self-exonerating. It means becoming conscious enough of both your genuine contribution and your child's genuine, separate agency, that you're no longer swinging helplessly between the two extremes, but standing somewhere steadier in between, able to say, honestly, I made real mistakes, some of which I understand now and didn't then, and my child also made choices that are genuinely theirs, separate from me, that I don't have to carry as my own failure. That sentence is much harder to hold than either extreme, but it's also, according to everyone we've discussed today, the only version that's actually true, and the only version stable enough to build real repair on top of. If this gave you a way to finally step off that pendulum between blaming yourself completely and blaming your child completely, that's exactly the kind of deep, difficult ground this channel exists to walk with you through. The third voice is here for the parts of this that don't have easy answers. So if this helped, subscribe, because we're going to keep going into exactly this kind of territory. Next time, we're going to look at what happens on the other side of this same shadow work. How adult children carry their own version of this exact guilt and blame pendulum, and why understanding their side of it might be the missing piece that finally makes your own healing make sense. That's next time here on The Third Voice.